They really thought that if they gathered enough people, spread enough rumors, and formed a united front, you would finally fold. They banked on their numbers. They believed that if enough voices spoke against you at the same time, your confidence would crack, your spirit would break, and your truth would disappear beneath the noise. But they forgot one ancient spiritual rule. Collective chaos always shatters when it collides with singular purpose. And that's exactly what happened. You were standing there alone, or at least that's how it looked. No cheering section. No army behind you. No campaign defending your name. No endless explanations. No desperate attempts to convince people of your innocence. Just silence. Just endurance. Just truth. And that terrified them more than anything. Because people who operate through manipulation understand something most others don't. They know lies require maintenance. They know false narratives need constant reinforcement. They know group attacks only work when the target participates in the drama. But you didn't. You stopped feeding the machine. You stopped begging for understanding. You stopped chasing people who had already chosen a side. The moment you did that, the energy shifted. Listen, many of you watching this know exactly what that feels like. The family gathering where everyone suddenly treated you differently. The workplace where conversations stopped when you walked into the room. The friend group that quietly excluded you while pretending everything was fine. The whispers. The fake concern. The carefully crafted misunderstandings. You felt it. You knew something was happening long before anyone admitted it. And here's what they never expected. Instead of collapsing under the pressure, you evolved through it. Instead of becoming weaker, you became harder to manipulate. Instead of losing yourself, you found yourself. That's why this story isn't about victimhood. It's about survival. It's about spiritual resilience. It's about what happens when a person refuses to surrender their identity to a crowd determined to erase it. Because by the end of this journey, you're going to see something remarkable. The very people who thought their numbers guaranteed victory are now living with the consequences of underestimating one person who refused to bow. And the first reason their entire strategy was doomed from the beginning is something most people never understand. It starts with the hidden weakness inside every toxic mob. Number 1, the fragility of mob mentality. One of the biggest mistakes people make when they find themselves being attacked by a group is assuming the group is strong simply because it's large. But numbers and strength are not the same thing. In fact, some of the weakest structures in the world appear powerful from the outside. That's because their power doesn't come from truth, loyalty, or genuine connection. It comes from fear. And anything built on fear is already cracking beneath the surface. That's what many of your enemies never realized. They looked united. They sounded united. They repeated the same talking points. They defended one another publicly. They created the illusion of solidarity. But what you were actually looking at was a collection of insecure people desperately protecting a shared narrative. And those are two very different things. Listen carefully. Healthy relationships are built on mutual respect. Healthy communities are built on trust. Healthy families are built on accountability. But toxic groups often survive through something much darker. They bond over a common target. They need someone to blame, someone to ridicule, someone to carry the emotional weight they refuse to confront within themselves. For a while, that person was you. The moment they gathered together, they felt powerful. The gossip gave them a sense of belonging. The exclusion gave them a sense of control. The rumors gave them a sense of superiority. They convinced themselves that if enough people agreed with a lie, the lie would somehow become the truth. But spiritual law doesn't work that way. Truth doesn't become weaker because 10 people reject it. Truth remains truth. And eventually reality demands payment from everyone who tried to distort it. That's why toxic alliances rarely last. They aren't connected by love. They're connected by convenience. They're connected by mutual fear. They're connected by unspoken agreements that sound something like this. I'll support your behavior if you support mine. The problem is that these agreements always have an expiration date. Because the same person willing to betray someone else for the group is eventually willing to betray the group itself. Let that sink in. The very behaviors that brought them together are the same behaviors that guarantee their collapse. The gossiper eventually gossips about everyone. The manipulator eventually manipulates everyone. The liar eventually lies to everyone. And when that happens, trust begins to disappear. This is why many of you noticed something strange during your own experience. Even while the attacks were happening, something felt off. Some people looked uncomfortable. Some avoided eye contact. Some repeated accusations they couldn't actually explain. Some followed the crowd but seemed nervous whenever deeper questions were asked. You felt that, didn't you? Because beneath the confidence they projected was uncertainty. Beneath the performance was fear. Beneath the unity was instability. And here's what they never expected. Every day you survived without breaking exposed how weak their foundation really was. They thought constant pressure would destroy you. Instead, it exposed them. Because every failed attempt to provoke you forced them to become louder. Every failed attempt to isolate you forced them to become more obvious. Every failed attempt to control the narrative revealed just how desperately they needed the narrative to survive. And people started noticing. Maybe not immediately. Maybe not publicly. But quietly. Subtly. The cracks began to appear. Someone started questioning the story. Someone noticed inconsistencies. Someone remembered details that didn't match what they were being told. Someone began wondering why so much energy was being spent attacking one person who wasn't even fighting back. That's when the illusion started falling apart. Because mobs depend on emotional momentum. Once people start thinking independently, the spell begins to break. And that's exactly why your presence became so threatening. You weren't just surviving the attack. You were exposing the weakness hidden inside the entire system. By refusing to become what they accused you of being, you forced reality to reveal itself. No screaming. No revenge. No public warfare. Just time. Just truth. Just consistency. And trust me, nothing terrifies a toxic group more than a person who remains calm while their entire strategy slowly collapses around them. But as unsettling as your calmness was, there was something else that frightened them even more. The fact that you weren't reacting the way they expected. And that's where the entire situation started becoming dangerous for them. Number 2, the fear of the unknown. What truly unsettled them wasn't your anger. It wasn't your sadness. It wasn't even your strength. It was your unpredictability. Because the moment they launched their campaign against you, they already had a script prepared in their minds. They expected tears. They expected panic. They expected endless explanations. They expected you to chase people down, defend your reputation, and desperately fight for acceptance. That's how these situations usually work. The target becomes emotional. The target becomes reactive. The target becomes easy to control. But you did something they never planned for. You stepped outside the script. And when you did, fear entered the room. Listen, manipulative people are rarely afraid when they believe they understand your next move. Their confidence comes from predictability. As long as they know how you'll respond, they can position themselves accordingly. They can prepare their defenses. They can adjust their stories. They can keep the game going. But the moment they can't predict you anymore, everything changes. Suddenly they're the ones feeling uncertain. Suddenly they're the ones losing sleep. Suddenly they're the ones wondering what's happening behind the scenes. And that's exactly what happened. While they were expecting a breakdown, you became quieter. While they were expecting confrontation, you created distance. While they were expecting emotional chaos, you chose observation. Now watch this. The silence they thought would destroy you became the silence that destroyed their confidence. Because once you stopped reacting, they lost access to information. They no longer knew what you were thinking. They no longer knew what you were planning. They no longer knew who supported you. They no longer knew what evidence you possessed. They no longer knew whether their actions were being noticed by other people. And human beings fear uncertainty more than almost anything else. Especially people who are used to controlling narratives. You see, when toxic groups attack someone, They often assume they have complete visibility. They think they know every relationship you have. They think they know who believes them and who doesn't. They think they understand the entire situation. But your calmness introduced a variable they couldn't calculate. You became an unknown factor. And unknown factors make insecure people panic. This is where many chosen ones accidentally gain power without even realizing it. Not because they're playing games. Not because they're trying to manipulate anyone. But because they stop participating in the emotional theater. They stop explaining themselves to people committed to misunderstanding them. They stop seeking validation from people invested in rejecting them. They stop proving what should never have required proof in the first place. And suddenly the entire dynamic shifts. The hunters become observers. The attackers become anxious. The confident become suspicious. The loud become restless. Because they need a reaction. They need confirmation that their strategy is working. They need evidence that they've successfully entered your mind. When they don't get it, they start creating their own fears. Maybe they're losing control. Maybe other people are starting to see through the story. Maybe the truth is spreading. Maybe the target isn't as weak as we thought. Maybe we've made a mistake. And once those thoughts begin circulating, paranoia starts doing what truth hasn't even needed to do yet. It starts tearing the group apart from the inside. This is why some of the people involved became increasingly aggressive over time. You noticed that, didn't you? The attacks didn't become calmer. They became more desperate. The rumors became more dramatic. The accusations became more exaggerated. The behavior became more irrational. That's because fear was entering the system. Deep down, they were realizing something they never wanted to admit. You weren't breaking. You were adapting. And every day you remained steady forced them to confront a possibility they found terrifying. What if the person we targeted isn't the problem? What if we've misjudged them? What if we've underestimated them? And most frightening of all, what if they were stronger than all of us combined? That's the question they never wanted to ask. Because once that question enters the conversation, their certainty begins to crumble. And when certainty disappears, arrogance usually follows. Which brings us to the next point. Because the very confidence that made them attack you in the first place eventually became the weapon that exposed them to everyone around them. Number 3. Weaponizing their arrogance. If fear planted the seeds of their downfall, arrogance accelerated it. Because once a toxic group convinces itself that victory is guaranteed, something predictable happens. They become careless. They stop being strategic. They stop protecting the image they've worked so hard to create. And that's exactly where everything started going wrong for them. At the beginning, they were cautious. Conversations happened behind closed doors. Criticism was disguised as concern. Manipulation was wrapped in politeness. Every move felt calculated because they still viewed you as a potential threat. But over time, something shifted. The more people they believed were on their side, the more confident they became. The more confident they became, the less disciplined they became. And that's where arrogance entered the picture. Listen carefully. Arrogant people often make one dangerous assumption. They mistake silence for defeat. They assume that because you're not arguing, you're losing. Because you're not defending yourself every day, you must not have a defense. Because you've stepped away from the conflict, they assume you've surrendered. But wisdom has always looked like weakness to people who only understand power struggles. While they were busy celebrating what they thought was their victory, they started exposing themselves. They contradicted their own stories. They revealed motives they once tried to hide. They became increasingly emotional, increasingly reckless, and increasingly obvious. What once looked coordinated slowly started looking desperate. Here's what they missed. The more convinced they became that nobody was paying attention, the more openly they behaved. The mask didn't fall because someone ripped it off. The mask fell because their own ego made them careless enough to stop holding it in place. And once that happened, people started noticing things they hadn't noticed before. Maybe it wasn't dramatic. Maybe it wasn't public. But doubts began forming. Questions started appearing. Small inconsistencies became harder to ignore. The same people who once accepted everything at face value quietly started reevaluating what they had been told. That's how exposure usually happens. Not through one explosive moment. Not through one shocking revelation. Through patterns. Repeated patterns. Consistent behavior that eventually becomes impossible to explain away. Every unnecessary attack. Every exaggerated accusation. Every attempt to keep the narrative alive long after you had moved on. All of it became evidence. And here's the brutal truth. Healthy people don't obsess over someone they've supposedly defeated. Healthy people don't spend endless energy tearing down someone they claim not to care about. The longer they continued attacking, the more they exposed what was really driving them. It wasn't truth. It wasn't justice. It wasn't concern. It was insecurity. It was control. It was fear. And by the time they realized other people were beginning to see it, the damage had already been done. Their confidence had turned into exposure. Their arrogance had become evidence. And the very army they built was about to face its greatest problem yet. Because once cracks appear inside a toxic alliance, loyalty disappears quickly. People stop protecting the group and start protecting themselves. That's when the blame starts shifting. That's when the betrayals begin. And that's when the entire structure starts collapsing from the inside out. Number 4, the collapse of their unity. This is the part they never saw coming. When the attacks first began, they believed their greatest advantage was numbers. They thought the larger the group became, the stronger they would become. More people meant more influence. More voices meant more credibility. More agreement meant more power. At least that's what they told themselves. But what they failed to understand is that toxic unity is not real unity. Real unity survives pressure. Real unity survives disagreement. Real unity survives difficult conversations because it is built on trust. Toxic unity survives only as long as everyone benefits from the arrangement. The moment pressure enters the system, people begin looking for someone else to blame. And eventually, pressure always enters the system. Listen, the same people who once appeared inseparable were never truly loyal to one another. They were loyal to the role each person played. One provided validation. Another provided gossip. Another provided influence. Another provided emotional support for the narrative. As long as everyone received something in return, the alliance remained intact. But once cracks started appearing, the entire dynamic changed. Suddenly people began noticing inconsistencies. Certain stories no longer matched. Certain individuals started distancing themselves from previous statements. Some became quieter. Others became defensive. A few started rewriting history altogether. People who once spoke with absolute certainty now spoke with hesitation. You felt that shift, didn't you? Maybe nobody admitted it directly. Maybe nobody called a meeting and announced that things were falling apart. But you could sense it. The energy changed. The confidence disappeared. The certainty wasn't there anymore. That's because fear had quietly entered the group. Not fear of you, fear of each other. And that's always the beginning of the end. Because once trust disappears inside a toxic alliance, paranoia takes its place. Every member begins wondering who might talk. Every member begins questioning who can be trusted. Every member starts calculating how to protect themselves if the entire situation collapses. Now watch this. The very people who once demanded your loyalty suddenly become suspicious of one another. The same individuals who united against you start questioning each other's motives. Private conversations become sources of anxiety. Secrets become liabilities. Information becomes leverage. What once looked like a powerful army begins looking more like a room full of people guarding their own exits. This is why so many chosen ones eventually witness something remarkable. The people who spent years scrutinizing their actions suddenly become consumed by internal conflict. Relationships that once appeared solid begin breaking apart. Long-standing friendships become strained. Alliances weaken. Resentments surface. Old betrayals are remembered. And none of it requires your involvement. That's the part many people struggle to understand. You don't have to engineer their downfall. You don't have to expose every lie. You don't have to fight every battle. Once a toxic system loses its common target, it often begins feeding on itself. The same judgment they directed toward you gets redirected internally. The same criticism they used against you starts circulating within the group. The same distrust they projected outward begins turning inward. Because unresolved toxicity never disappears. It simply looks for a new destination. For years, you carried emotions that never belonged to you. Expectations that never belonged to you. Blame that never belonged to you. And when you finally stepped away from the role they assigned you, all of that energy had nowhere left to go except back to its source. That's when reality starts collecting its debt. Slowly, quietly, relentlessly. People begin facing consequences they never expected. Not because you're seeking revenge. Not because karma arrives with dramatic announcements. But because every unhealthy system eventually reaches the point where it can no longer sustain itself. And here's what makes this stage so powerful. For the first time, you're no longer fighting to survive their opinion of you. You're watching from a distance as the structure that once seemed unstoppable struggles to hold itself together. The people who once believed they controlled the narrative are now struggling to control the consequences of their own actions. The army they built didn't defeat you. The army they built defeated itself. And by the time the dust settles, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. You were never the weak link in their story. You were the mirror exposing everything they didn't want to see. Which brings us to the most important part of this entire journey. Because surviving the mob wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about becoming something they never imagined possible. Something that will outlive every rumor, every attack, and every attempt to erase your name. Number 5. The legacy of defiance. At the beginning of this journey, you thought you were fighting for survival. You thought the goal was simply to make it through the attacks, to endure the isolation, to withstand the criticism, to keep moving forward despite the pressure being placed on you from every direction. But now, standing where you stand today, you can see something much bigger. This was never just about surviving them. This was about becoming someone they could never control again. Because every chosen one eventually reaches a moment when they realize the battle was never truly external. Yes, people talked. Yes, people judged. Yes, people attempted to define your identity for you. But the deepest battle was happening within. It was the battle between who they said you were and who you knew yourself to be. And that's why your victory matters. Not because you destroyed your enemies. Not because you proved everyone wrong. Not because you got the last word. Your victory matters because you refused to abandon yourself. Listen, many people spend their entire lives shaping their identity around the expectations of others. They become who their family wants them to be, who their friends want them to be, who society wants them to be. They trade authenticity for acceptance and call it peace. But you couldn't do that. Your path required something different. It required courage. It required discernment. It required the willingness to stand alone when standing alone was the more painful option. And that's exactly why this experience transformed you. Every betrayal sharpened your intuition. Every rejection strengthened your self-respect. Every attempt to silence you taught you the value of your own voice. Every season of isolation forced you to discover a level of resilience you never knew existed. What they intended as destruction became preparation. What they intended as humiliation became initiation. What they intended as your ending became the foundation of your next chapter. That's how spiritual growth often works. The very experiences designed to break you become the experiences that reveal who you truly are. And here's something even more important. When one person refuses to carry a toxic role any longer, a generational pattern is interrupted. The scapegoat stops accepting blame. The truth teller stops apologizing for speaking honestly. The cycle that existed for years, sometimes decades, loses its ability to continue through them. That's why your stand mattered. You weren't only protecting yourself. You were drawing a line that future generations may never have to draw again. Think about that for a moment. The courage that felt lonely at the time may become the reason someone else finds freedom later. The boundaries that cost you relationships may become the example that helps another person reclaim their own life. The truth you protected may continue creating ripples long after every rumor about you has disappeared. That's legacy. And unlike gossip, legacy survives. Unlike manipulation, legacy survives. Unlike fear, legacy survives. The people who united against you believed your story would end in isolation. Instead, it became a testimony of endurance, a testimony of discernment, a testimony of what happens when one person refuses to surrender their soul to the demands of a crowd. And that is something no army can ever take away.